She was only 5 years old, too small to reach the top cupboards, too young to understand why grown-ups sometimes cried quietly when they thought no one was looking. But she understood love. She understood safety. She understood the way her father's arms felt when he lifted her at the end of a long day, warm, tired, protective. His name was Arthur Church, a hard-working man in the quiet rural edges of New Brunswick, where winter mornings began before the sun and dreams belonged to people strong enough to survive them. And on that cold morning in 1964, the world felt ordinary, familiar, until the sound came, a thud, heavy, wrong. Little Cher Church froze. Footsteps on the wooden floor felt loud, echoing through the stillness. She turned, expecting a playful grin, a father pretending to fall, maybe one of his silly morning jokes. But there was no laughter, no movement. Just the still shape of the strongest person she knew, collapsed on the kitchen floor, one hand still clutching the edge of the table as though he had tried, in his last moment, to hold on. "Daddy?" The word floated into the air like a fragile leaf in a storm. No answer. "Daddy?" Her voice stayed small because she didn't yet understand she was entering a moment that would change history. His chest rose weakly, then stopped. Panic rushed into her tiny body like ice water. She had never been taught what to do when life suddenly cracks open. There was no cartoon, no school lesson, no refrigerator magnet telling her what number to call. There was no emergency number at all, no 911, no universal hotline, just confusion, fear, and silence. She ran to the phone, the old rotary one mounted on the wall, too high for her but close enough for desperate hands to grab at it. She remembered watching her parents call the operator once. A faceless voice that connected calls by hand, an invisible guardian of wires and switches. Maybe that person would know how to help. Maybe that person could bring someone. She pulled a chair across the floor, climbed shakily, and lifted the heavy receiver. "I need help," she whispered, breath trembling, eyes flooding. "Daddy fell." The operator must have recognized the terror in that tiny voice because suddenly her tone shifted from routine to alarm. Questions filled the line. "Where are you? What happened? Stay with me, sweetheart." And in that moment, two strangers held the world together through a cord stretched over rural snow and silent fields. Cher tried to answer, but she was only 5. Her house didn't have a number anyone used. Her world was a land where directions sounded like near the farm road, past the mill, not street names and coordinates. The operator's fingers flew over switches and lines, trying to summon help, trying to decode a child's trembling words in a time before emergency systems existed. Minutes crawled like hours, every second stretched by fear, every heartbeat echoing through a kitchen that smelled of coffee never poured and life suddenly interrupted. "Please hurry," she cried. "Please help my daddy." But help in 1964 was not fast, not organized, not guaranteed. Rural doctors drove their own cars, responding only when someone could reach them. Neighbors sometimes acted as emergency responders. Fate chose winners and victims. Those minutes, those heavy, helpless minutes, would later echo through time, through phone lines, through governments and boardrooms and innovation labs. But little Cher didn't know that. She didn't know she was living in the quiet space between life and death, where history sometimes begins with heartbreak. By the time the local doctor finally arrived, the world had already shifted. The man who lifted her every day was gone. Her tiny fingers still clutched the phone, knuckles white, breath shaking. The doctor placed a hand on her shoulder, but the room felt colder than winter. Neighbors gathered. A blanket wrapped around her. Someone whispered prayers. But grief has a sound, and that sound was louder than any voice in the room. And somewhere in the shadows of human progress, the question woke like a sudden storm. How many more families will suffer because there is no number to call? How many children must dial into chaos, hoping someone hears them? How many seconds must decide who lives and who doesn't? It took a heartbreak, a tiny voice crying for help into the wires, to finally shake leaders awake. Behind closed doors after the tragedy, the conversation began. "It cannot happen again. We need a universal emergency number, a system for everyone, not just the lucky. A 5-year-old girl, unable to reach the world fast enough, unknowingly became the spark. Soon, engineers, lawmakers, phone companies, and emergency officials across North America began whispering the same idea, an idea born not from technology first, but from humanity, one number to save lives, one number every child can remember, one number that stands between fear and hope. They didn't yet know the name. They didn't yet know the scale. They only knew no one could ever be that alone again. In the weeks that followed, the church family buried a father, a community mourned, and a country contemplated its own silence. But grief, when powerful enough, doesn't just break, it builds. And little Cher, who once stood, shaking on a kitchen chair, had unknowingly placed the first stone in a foundation that would someday hold a continent. The story of saving millions didn't begin in a board meeting or a technology lab. It began in a quiet kitchen, with a child's voice trembling through a handset, calling the only number she knew, hoping the world would answer. And soon, it would reply, Part 2 when you're ready for the continuation. I will continue into the rise of the 911 movement, the first implementation, and the poetic full circle ending, 911 saving children because one child once couldn't be saved. Grief is not loud at first. It sits quietly in the corners of a home, in pictures still hanging, in half-finished cups on a table, in shoes by a door waiting for footsteps that will never come again. For little Cher, the world didn't end in an explosion. It faded into a quiet she didn't have words for. Her mother tried to be strong. Friends tried to be steady. But there is a kind of silence no hug can erase. The silence of a child asking questions the world isn't prepared to answer. Why didn't they come faster? Why didn't someone hear her sooner? Why wasn't there a number to call when life was slipping away? Those questions were whispered first in the church home, and then far beyond it. The operator, who heard her tiny voice crying for help, could not forget it. She confessed to colleagues she'd never heard a more frightened call. She replayed it in her mind, the strain, the desperation, the not knowing. She knew she had done everything she could, and yet she felt she hadn't done enough, because the system wasn't enough. Soon, doctors, nurses, telephone workers, public safety officials, people whose lives revolved around emergencies, began murmuring the same realization. A world without a universal emergency number was a world gambling with lives. In cities, emergencies moved faster than phone books. In rural places like New Brunswick, a crisis could fall through cracks wide as fields. Operators could only help if they knew how to reach someone. Dispatch was a hope, not a guarantee. Seconds were swallowed by confusion, by distance, by systems that didn't yet understand what urgency meant in human lives. And so the debate began. Not loud, not sensational, but persistent, like water slowly carving stone. Why did some nations have systems and others didn't? Why could a country put men into space, but not guarantee help at home? Phone companies brought engineers into meetings. Police departments held quiet internal discussions. Politicians listened to early reports with furrowed brows. For the first time, someone wrote the idea down not as a dream, but as a necessity, a single emergency number. Not a list, not a directory page with 20 offices, one number. Universal, immediate, a lifeline, even a child could memorize. Meanwhile, life moved on around little Cher, as life always does. She returned to routines that didn't fit right anymore. She played, but her laughter felt borrowed from a time before loss. She slept, but the nights felt longer. She tried to understand why the strongest person she knew hadn't been saved, and she carried that ache behind her eyes like a shadow that never left. Years passed in the world outside her small town, but her moment, that moment, continued to echo. In Washington, lawmakers reviewed reports from Canada. They began to study tragedies, cases where help came too late because someone dialed the wrong number, or didn't know who to call, or got lost in transfers and delays. Then somewhere in a boardroom, a question emerged that would change history. What if it happens again and we could have prevented it? Some inventions are born from curiosity. Others are born from competition, from invention, from opportunity. But some, the most human ones, are born from heartbreak. Experts debated which number. How would people learn it? Would it work in cities and in rural farm towns like shares? Would phone companies agree? Would governments fund it? Would people believe in it? Every obstacle stood in the way. Technology, geography, politics, money. But not a single obstacle could rival the truth. A child called for help once, and the world wasn't ready to answer. So engineers sketched circuits. Policymakers drafted plans. Public safety leaders wrote protocols. And for the first time, the idea began to live in real ink, on real paper, with real timelines. While behind it, unseen, the ghost of a child's trembling voice kept pushing, pushing, pushing. And then came the meeting that changed everything. Representatives from Bell Systems and the U.S. Federal Communications Commission sat together to discuss creating an emergency number that would work everywhere. They studied options, long numbers, short numbers, combinations. They needed something universal, something fast, something easy enough for a frightened child, even one climbing a chair, crying into a receiver, to dial without thinking. They needed something that would save seconds. And finally, they chose 3 numbers, 911, short, sharp, impossible to mistake, scrawled on paper, proposed formally, whispered into radio newsrooms, printed in early briefs. The idea started moving through networks like electricity charged with purpose. At first, the world didn't react. Ideas always start like that. Invisible, quiet, fragile enough to break if one person in power shrugs at the wrong moment. But fate didn't shrug this time. It leaned in. Soon, communities ran tests. Phone companies prepared lines. Cities trained dispatchers. Volunteers practiced scripts. Slowly, painfully slowly, the dream began to grow roots. Still, nothing happened overnight. Children took years to learn the number in school. Households took time to trust it. Governments debated funding. Some doubted it would work. Some believed emergencies would never touch them at all. But history does not move on convenience. It moves on necessity. And necessity had already arrived the day a little girl reached for a phone to save her father and found herself alone with fear. That moment had already written itself into time. Her father's death had already become a silent argument in every meeting room where safety was planned. And so, one small community tragedy, one moment in a kitchen that should have been just a memory of breakfast and warmth, was transforming into a nationwide system, designed to prevent thousands of futures from breaking the same way hers did. Still, for Cher, life remained simple. She grew older, learned new routines, held memories like folded photographs in her heart, edges softened by time but never erased. She didn't know she had started something. She didn't know her tears had become blueprints. She didn't know that every time a dispatcher answered a call, spoke calmly into chaos, sent help racing down streets and across fields, a piece of her moment lived there. All she knew was that she once called for help, and no one came fast enough. And then, miles away, years later, in a small Alabama town, history quietly clicked into place. At 2:00 p.m. on February 16, 1968, the first ever 911 call was placed, a demonstration, a test, but a heartbeat all the same. A sheriff picked up a phone, dialed 3 numbers, and a dispatcher answered. Simple, ordinary, life-changing, and just like that, in a moment as small and quiet as the one that began it, the bridge between fear and help was built. And it all began with a child's voice trembling into a phone on a winter morning when the world didn't yet know how to save her father. The first 911 call in Alabama was short, simple, almost ordinary. A sheriff dialed 3 numbers and someone answered. Just a test, not a real emergency. But history rarely announces itself with fireworks. Sometimes it whispers, just enough for those paying attention to feel the ground shift. Words spread slowly, like sunrise creeping over a horizon. Newspapers mentioned it. Local radio stations reported it. Most people shrugged, not realizing they had just witnessed the beginning of one of the greatest safety systems ever created. But while the world went back to its quiet routines, others kept pushing, Public safety officers pushed. Phone companies pushed. Emergency physicians pushed. Communities who'd lived through tragedy pushed. And beneath it all, the echo of one childhood cry, "I need help. My daddy fell," continued rolling through time, shaping decisions in meeting rooms far from where it was first spoken. Because sometimes, a single voice can move systems no one thought could ever change. But progress is a patient worker. It moves one town at a time, one budget meeting at a time, one dispatcher trained, one phone line installed, one school teaching children 3 digits that could save them. Still, there were challenges. Some cities resisted. Some politicians argued the cost. Some people believed emergencies belonged to luck, not planning. Yet tragedies kept happening, each one a reminder that life does not wait for bureaucracy. In homes, children still panicked during emergencies. On highways, crash victims still relied on chance. In neighborhoods, neighbors still sprinted door to door praying someone knew who to call. But slowly, beautifully, the map changed. Dots appeared. Lines formed. Centers opened. Dispatchers were trained, not just to answer phones, but to stay calm when the world around them shook. And 911, just numbers at first, began turning into the strongest promise a country could offer its people. We will answer. We will come. You are not alone. Decade by decade, the system grew. Cities adopted it. Then states. Then entire nations. Canada followed. Then countries around the world built their own versions, inspired by the same lesson, that time is fragile, and help should never be a maze. Soon, school children learned it before they learned multiplication. Posters hung in classrooms. Cartoons taught toddlers to remember. Grandparents taped the digits near telephones. Everyone, rich or poor, young or old, carried the same lifeline. And somewhere in New Brunswick, a little girl grew into a woman. Life moved forward. Loss softened but never disappeared. Memories stayed tucked in her heart. Her father's hands, his laugh, the day the house filled with voices and yet felt unbearably empty. She didn't grow up thinking she had changed the world. She didn't know that somewhere, a 7-year-old boy dialing 911 during his mother's seizure survived because someone answered instantly. She didn't know firefighters made it in time to pull a baby from smoke because a neighbor remembered 3 numbers. She didn't know a teenager trapped in a car whispered those digits and lived to walk again. She didn't know. Because true heroes often don't. They simply live, unaware of the ripple their moment sent across an entire world. And then, one day many years later, a journalist tracked her down. He had traced the beginnings of the 911 movement, piecing together the sparks that lit the fire. And he told her, gently, respectfully, that her call, her fear, her tiny voice had been part of the reason millions more would never face the same helplessness. She cried quietly, not from pride, but from grief turning full circle into purpose. Her father was gone. But through his death, the world learned how to save others. History does not always need statues. Sometimes it remembers in the ringing of a phone, and for every emergency answered today, for every dispatcher who steadies a shaking voice, for every paramedic racing through a red light, for every firefighter kicking down a burning door, for every police officer responding to danger, for every mother, father, child, stranger who dials 3 numbers and hears help answer, a piece of that morning in 1964 lives on. A 5-year-old girl couldn't save her father. But without realizing it, she helped save millions. Her fear became a foundation. Her call became a catalyst. Her heartbreak became humanity's safety net. Now, in cities and small towns, on highways and in classrooms, in homes and hospitals and quiet kitchens just like hers. 3 numbers sit ready, not as technology, but as a promise. Dial 911. Someone will answer. Dial 911. Help is already coming. Dial 911. You are not alone. And somewhere in the quiet history of ordinary courage, the world remembers a little girl who dialed the only number she knew and changed what it means to ask for help forever.